So allow me to begin with a note to feminist art historian Nita Nöckling and her pivotal 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Nöckling deconstructed the patriarchal myth of the male genius by exposing how entrenched power dynamics within educational and institutional frameworks shape societal perceptions of artistic value. The scholar warned that even attempting to answer such a question risks reinforcing its negative implications about women's artistic capabilities. I first encountered this essay in the mid-1990s during postgraduate studies in England. It helped me understand the roots of the challenges that many women, including myself, faced in pursuing photography. Although women in Greece have dynamically engaged with photography since the late 19th century, as Mariana Karali and Evi Papadopoulou discussed in last year's Fast Forward conference in Thessaloniki, women's contributions were long overlooked, lacking critical and curatorial attention until the end of the 20th century. In this presentation, I will explore her histories and her photographies within the Greek paradigm, focusing on systemic inequality and the structural barriers to women's photographic practice. I'll examine two phases of photography's institutionalization that influenced the development of women photographies in Greece, the 1980s and the 1990s. I will conclude by arguing that during the 1990s, women's hybrid and experimental photographic practices directly challenged the male-formulated canon of creative photography. I regard these efforts to re-articulate the medium as a gender act of creative and ideological dissent. For much of the 20th century, photography in Greece was marginalized. Plagued by its utilitarian and popular functions, it was perceived as a banal form of folk art situated on the fringes of the visual arts mainstream. In the 1950s and 1960s, the field was polarized between two dominant strands. On one end stood the amateur humanist photographic practice promoted by the Hellenic Photographic Society, which advocated the continuity of ancient and modern Greece for both national pride and to international tourism. On the other end featured the professional documentation of the country's post-war reconstruction and modernization, largely by male photographers, including Dimitris Charisiadis, Spiros Meletsis, and Kostas Balafas, many of whom were society members. Women like Voula Papaioannou, who was the official photographer of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration during the 1940s, and Maria Hrusaki, an amateur photographer and a Red Cross nurse, contributed to the Society's activities as well as the publications of the National Tourism Organization. However, these contrasting yet equally uncritical visual narratives often mask the country's harsher post-Civil War realities, including rapid urbanization, emigration, and political oppression. The colonial's dictatorship of 1967 imposed censorship and red-baiting prosecutions that drove much of the intelligentsia into exile until the restoration of democracy in 1974. In this context, photography in post-war Greece lacked institutional support and critical engagement. Those embracing the medium as creative expression were caught between a rock and a hard place. Either align with the amateur aesthetics of the Photographic Society and the international salons, or struggle independently to find and fund places and spaces to exhibit their work. A new generation of photographers emerged in the 1970s, marking the beginning of what photographer and writer John Stathatos termed New Greek photography. Having studied or worked abroad in Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, these predominantly male photographers became the key proponents of creative photography, newly defined as personal expression characterized by thematic and morphological consistency. As witnessed in North America, Western Europe, and Australia, The late 1970s and 1980s saw the emergence of a variety of photography institutions in Greece, including exhibition spaces, festivals, clubs, specialist magazines, and publishing initiatives, mainly instigated and led, again, by male photographers. Key developments included the launch of Photographia magazine, the founding of the Photography Center of Athens, the creation of Parallaxes, which initiate the idea of a national museum for photography, and the Hellenic Center of Photography that launched the International Month of Photography in Athens. Academic recognition followed with the 1985 creation of the photography department at the Technological Educational Institution of Athens. Also connecting Greek photography with international trends during the pre-internet era. This nexus of institutions fostered photography's growth as an expressive medium, expanding, as Iro Katsaridou has argued, across most photographic practices, including documentary and snapshot photography, and leading to a paradigm shift at the turn of the century. Yet, in this still profoundly male-dominated terrain, women practitioners would be faced with challenges and exclusions. Following the restoration of democracy in mid-1970s, legal reforms around gender equality were introduced, with major legislation on women's discrimination in labor and family law, including divorce and child rights, enacted in 1982 under the socialist government. These changes helped increase women's workforce participation from 24.7% in 1981 to 35.3% by 1990. However, economic challenges, including high inflation and expensive imported photographic equipment, long considered luxury items, made it difficult for aspiring photographers, especially women, to access the medium. Limited income, scarce professional opportunities, and disproportionate domestic and caring responsibilities further restricted women's engagement with photography. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the visibility of women photographers, whether amateur or professionals, remained fairly limited in the local scene. Amateurs faced male-centric technophilic photo clubs and magazines, while professionals navigated a hostile male industry where the rarity of individual copyright credits and the lack of institutional interest in preserving such work made many women's contributions difficult to recover today. I'd now like to share some examples of the gender disparities that significantly influenced how women's photographic practice was disseminated and documented, profoundly affecting the remembrance of her photographies and her stories. In the first International Month of Photography in Athens in 1987, organized by the Hellenic Center for Photography, only 3 solo exhibitions out of 54 were by Greek women photographers: Nellis, Voula Papaioannou, and Olga Kalousi. While Nellis and Papaioannou's interwar and post-war work was being re-evaluated, representation of contemporary women photographers remained minimal. In the group show of 20 Greek photographers at the Photography Center of Athens, just 7 women were included, selected by an all-male panel. At the festival's International Symposium of Photographic Press, not a single woman photographer, curator, editor, or publisher was invited to speak. This gender imbalance continued in subsequent editions. The second month included only 1 woman, the artist Lizzie Kaliga, in the one-man shows. The gender term was not coincidental, as you can see. The third organization in 1991 saw a modest improvement with 3 women's shows among 16 exhibitions: Eleni Malikoura, Lizzie Kaligas, and Despina Maroglu, whose work was classed as experimental. Similar patterns were observed in the new Greek photographers competition of the Hellenic Center of Photography. And I have marked contribution by women photographers in pink. Thessaloniki's Photosynkiria Festival mirrored this disparity. Only 2 international women practitioners were included in the first 2 organizations of Photosynkiria Festival, while Greek women photographers began to be included from the third organization onwards. Between 1988 and 1998, only 45 of the 441 exhibition participations were by Greek women, representing just 31 individuals. I'm not accusing the organizers of these festivals of misogyny. Admittedly, I was given opportunities to exhibit and curate work in both festivals since the late 1990s. However, I argue that overall, the structural support for Greek women's photographic practice was unequal and insufficient for it to flourish. As Knockley reminds us, male privilege often persists under the guise of merit, and I quote, "Most men, despite lip service to equality, are reluctant to give up this natural order of things." Zoe Kosmidou's study, Visuologos, Greek women artists, confirmed this wider trend across the Greek art world. Out of the 820 female artists mentioned in the art periodicals Arti and Art Magazine during the period 1990-1998, fewer than 10 had their work published on the covers of the publications or featured as the main subject. Even fewer were photographers. The establishment of academic programs for photography in higher education and private educational institutions from the mid-1980s onwards, alongside numerous photography associations and community clubs, would become a catalyst in the professionalization of women's photography. This story I would like to briefly narrate from a personal standpoint, if you would indulge me. My journey into photography began in 1990 when I enrolled in the photography department at the Faculty of Graphic Arts and Design at the Technological Educational Institution of Athens. At the time, this 4-year program was the only one of its kind in higher education in Greece, combining creative and applied photographic practices. Initially led by Kostis Antoniadis, founding member of the Photography Center of Athens, the department primarily comprised of male lecturers. Only 2 women photographers served as tutors for technical demonstrations. In the 1990s, photographic practice in Greece oscillated between a commitment to photographic realism and a critical interrogation of the medium's aesthetics, both in contrast to the hybrid interdisciplinary approaches seen in artist photography. Influenced by movements like visualist photography, which emerging in the 1980s focused on photographic perception, several Greek women at the time, included myself, explored alternative methods such as pinhole photography and low-tech cameras, a kind of photopovera, as a creative response to the impending digital revolution. While working as an editor of Photographos magazine, I witnessed firsthand the gender imbalance in the public discourse developing around the new state policy for art photography in 1995. Remarkably, only 3 women were officially involved in the State Task Committee, and none were included in the follow-up debates published by Photographos. This experience and the desire to actively contribute to the developing discourse drove me towards photographic theory and postgraduate study abroad, as such opportunities didn't exist at the time in Greece. I sold my darkroom equipment and all cameras but one to complement my meager savings and headed to England, where I encountered feminist theory and diverse lens-based practices that had been notably absent from my education in Greece. This longing for gender parity shaped my curatorial and editorial work during the relaunch of Photographiesin magazine at the end of that decade, and the 2000 International Month of Photography under the theme Unfamiliar City. The 1997 exhibition Image and Icon, the New Greek Photography, 1975 to 1995, curated by John Stathatos, marked a turning point in the critical recognition of women's photographic practice in Greece. While distinguishing between traditional fine art photography and a work of photographic art, Stathatos' selection placed 12 women in the latter category, but by fewer in sections focused on medium-specific or documentary work. Such distinctions reflect how women's work intersected with or diverged from the medium-specific canon of creative photography. I argue that many women practitioners use the aforementioned asymmetries and exclusions as a springboard from the margins to reimagine the medium within and beyond disciplinary boundaries. The 1990s was a determining decade for women's photographic practice and its professionalization in Greece, coinciding with a period of institutional growth and novel platforms for disseminating work. New opportunities, such as state scholarships for postgraduate study abroad, enabled many women to pursue advanced degrees in Europe. This new generation of women practitioners, theorists, curators, and writers embraced the postmodern critiques of photography and questioned entrenched genealogies, pictorial and thematic conventions. The Greek landscape became a site of such creative rapture. Women practitioners such as Natasha Markidou and Liana Albadidou challenged romanticized and orientalized traditions of the national landscape, as well as the deadpan aesthetic favored by many male counterparts. Experimenting with different technologies, from Polaroid materials to disposable panoramic cameras, these women worked to personalize and reframe the land. Simultaneously, a renewed interest in street photography and urban space emerged. Practitioners like F. Paleologu, Eleni Mouzakiti, and Penelope Pezzini reimagined the traditionally white male figure of the flaneur, the privileged urban wanderer, claiming the role of the flaneuse, documenting nocturnal explorations from a female perspective. Several women image makers also embraced lens-based experimentation, navigating the boundaries, passages, and mutations between still and moving images, technologies, and representational systems. Maria Dara, for instance, photographed television broadcasts and combined them with everyday scenes, while Despina May Maroglu appropriated and transformed global news imagery using painterly and digital methods. Techniques of staging and reenactment that blur the boundaries between reality and artifice, event and non-event, chance and performance also became central, especially in self-portraiture and representations of the home. Christina Dimitriadis inserted herself into domestic spaces, subverting objectifying norms, while Athena Chroni explored through photographic language the emotional states of the self. The revival of the International Month of Photography in Athens in 1997, an inspired Trojan horse move by the late Stavros Moresopoulos, helped bring photography into commercial galleries. Within this increased visibility came more opportunities for women. New institutions such as the Deste Foundation, the Momus Thessaloniki Museum of Photography, the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, alongside the photographic programming at the Benaki Museum, expanding the landscape for photographic practice. In the new millennium, exhibitions like Fusion Cuisine, curated by Katerina Oregos, and Disguises, Femininity, Masculinity, and Other Certainties, curated by Sira Godziara, began to institutionally confront and renegotiate gender inequality within the Greek visual art scene. Looking back today, we have come a long way from those ones asking why there have there been no great women, Greek women artists or photographers, as we begin to contemplate what if women rule the world, a statement which now features prominently on the sides of the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens. It was within this discourse of reasons that co-curators Iro Katsaridou, Areti Leopoulou, Penelope Pezzini, and I were able to stage the survey exhibition Herstories, Photographic Practices in Greece 1974 to 2024, the first ever survey of Greek women photographers presented at the Thessaloniki Museum of Photography and the Experimental Center for the Arts of Momus in 2024. As a sign of this changing institutional tide and the shift in women's consciousness as well, I'd like to close this presentation with an auspicious interpretation by my daughter of two figurine sets that recreate Dutch master paintings. Vermeer's milkmaid has jumped out of the frame, tagged Vincent van Gogh in bed, and grabbed his paintbrush, claiming agency and authorship. Thank you.